Hello. I'd like to begin by thanking, I'm going to speak English. I'd like to begin by thanking Irina Prokhorova for inviting me here today. I would like, and organizing this conference every year, I'd like to thank Yelena Marasinova for choosing me as a speaker and for trusting me enough to allow me to appear on the stage. My topic for today is the unofficial committee of Alexander I. Alexander I's unofficial committee may seem to be a strange choice for a panel about opposition. As you know, Alexander I met the members of the unofficial committee, Viktor Kochubey, Adam Czartoryski, Nikolai Novosiltsev, and Pavel Stroganov, when he was a fairly young man. And at the time, he allegedly shared with them quite strong anti-monarchical views, his belief in abolishing serfdom, his wish to create a constitution. And what's usually said, the sort of textbook version of the unofficial committee, is that the unofficial committee persuaded him not to follow any of these ideas, that it in fact had a rather conservative effect on his political outlook in the early years of his reign, from 1801 to 1803. So today I want to think about some other respects in which we might nevertheless think constructively of the unofficial committee as having been an oppositional group. And as I'll propose, it was secrecy, intimacy, and friendship which served them as strategies of opposition. What kind of opposition was this? It was an opposition in which the unofficial committee stood up to or proposed itself as standing outside of the state structures, outside of the court, even though it met at the court. We've already discussed how the 18th century was a century of contradictions and inner contradictions. So here we have courtiers who met Alexander at court, who nonetheless present themselves as private individuals, who present themselves as personal, intimate friends of Alexander, and choose intimacy and secrecy as a means of pressing their political views on him. The second content structure of their objection or their opposition in the reign of Alexander was to limit Alexander's powers by insisting on regularity of administrative procedure. So Alexander had wanted to create a constitution. They tried to talk him out of this proposal, but instead tried to limit his, what they called the arbitrary powers of the despot, by imposing on him regularity of administrative procedure. And so, and here again we have a kind of an inner conflict, because they, as an unofficial committee, not formally existing, entirely secret, and using their friendship, try to impose on an autocrat regularity of administrative procedure. So we have here quite a direct self-contradiction. To what extent it was painful, I'm not sure. Okay, so what was the basis of this, first of all, of their objection to the life of the courtier? After all, Kochubey, Stroganov, Novosiltsev, and Czartoryski were all courtiers. As I argued, this was a product of sentimentalism. All of these men, including Alexander I, were raised in the European spirit of sentimentalism, which taught them that the inner qualities of the human being should be derived from that the virtue or the qualities of the statesman, his capacity to lead the state and the society towards harmony and well-being, lay in interior qualities. Therefore, his right to perform political functions was not in birth or connections, but hinged on the correct calibration of mind and sentiments. So correct calibration of mind and sentiments in the way that we've already heard about today from Andrei Zorin. Social and political deficits arose when elites ceased to act on the basis of reason and virtue, and as well as sympathy and humanity, and began instead to follow personal interest, self-interest, which led them to pursue power and emoluments in a passionate way. So people give way to passions of self-interest and lust for power instead of following reason and the correct calibration of emotion, sympathy, and humanity. Sentimentalism also underpinned the conceptions of friendship, which guided the relationship between Alexander I and other members of the unofficial committee. There is a substantial literature about this that taught members of the sentimental public to treat each other as disinterested friends whose primary role in life was to support each other's views, to help each other discover the correct principles according to which they ought to live, and to propel each other to live according to those principles. So friends functioned in some ways as educators, as disciplinarians, as well as people one felt a personal sympathy for. These views were inculcated in Alexander I as a young man in the 1780s and 1790s by de la Harpe, his instructor from Switzerland, who taught him to view, who allegedly had quite republican political views, taught him to believe that constitutional government was the correct government for Russia, taught to believe him to believe in equality and the abolition of serfdom. La Harpe also emphasized to Alexander that his future success as an emperor hinged on personal virtues and not on his birth into the Romanov family. As he taught him, as he wrote to him, morals are equals. It is not birth, but solely virtue that distinguishes them. So La Harpe taught Alexander to believe that this virtue as an emperor needed to be his virtue as an emperor should be his primary concern when he came to power, maintaining his personal virtue both by consulting himself and by consulting intimate friends. At the same time, La Harpe taught Alexander to be highly suspicious of other courtiers who, La Harpe said, would use their influence on Alexander solely for the benefit of their own careers. Again, courtiers were considered people functionally incapable of thinking beyond their immediate interests toward the name of the wider social and political good. La Harpe was forced to leave Russia in 1795, dispatched by Catherine, and it was at this point that Alexander became close friends with the other members of the unofficial committee. One of the qualities that they had in common was that all had lived in Western Europe between 1789 and 1791 during the French Revolution. This is Stroganov and Kochubey were in France for several months in 1790 and 1791. Kochubey lived in England from 1788 to 1791, and Czartoryski lived there from 1789 to 1791. Alexander, with his constitutional views, his republican views, was attracted to them precisely for their having lived abroad. And in early meetings with them, he confided to them his belief in the constitution, his wish to abolish serfdom, and his wish to create some kind of constitutional or representative government in Russia. I'll just note parenthetically that in these early meetings, Alexander strongly emphasized secrecy. So secrecy here, in his early meetings with his young friends, is a kind of performance as well as a strategy. For example, he asked his friends whether they could devise secret signals in order to mark their meetings with one another. Catherine, as you know, died in 1796. Paul ascended to the throne, and most of the members of the unofficial committee left Russia into a kind of soft exile. They chose to leave because they disapproved of Pavel. Mostly they disapproved of his arbitrary manner of governance, the disorganization that reigned at court, the lack of administrative procedure, not simply the fact that he was an autocrat, but the manner in which he changed laws without consideration, and in which he promoted favoritism in his court. As members of the unofficial committee noted in their correspondence at this time, under Paul, factionalism and corruption grew to entirely new proportions. Kochubey, writing to Sergei Vorontsov, noted that intrigue and calumny had become dominant at court, where senior statesmen behaved like quote-unquote beggars, seeking solely to promote their own interests. So in leaving Pavel's court, there's a disgust for the life of the courtier, and there's also a sense that the state is fundamentally falling apart because the people who serve it are no longer able to calibrate their interest, their sentiments correctly, but are falling subject to the passions of interest. So when Paul was murdered brutally on the night of 11th of March 1801, he was murdered by courtiers under Catherine. He was murdered by some of his own trusted allies. And Alexander assented reluctantly to this coup. His friends did not welcome the death of Paul. There was no celebration of his death. Instead, they saw the turn of politics with Alexander ascending to the throne as an opportunity for further political dysfunction. They believed that the courtiers who brought Alexander to the power would continue to abuse their stations in the name of promoting their factions. And when Alexander called his friends back to St. Petersburg, they didn't exactly hurry. It took them several months to arrive. Nevertheless, they arrived, and as Kochubey put it, his decision to return was one of personal loyalty. He wrote, "I am leaving for St. Petersburg because I believe I owe something to Grand Duke Alexander. I am leaving because I think all honest people must reunite around him and direct all their efforts toward healing the infinite wounds that have been inflicted on the fatherland by his father." He made it very clear to Vorontsov that he wasn't looking for any position at court. He was simply making a decision on the basis of personal loyalties. He also explained that his intention was to help Alexander formulate and act on his own will. So as a friend, he's trying to help Alexander discover his needs and wishes and to act on them. As he wrote again to Vorontsov, his intentions, Alexander's, are excellent. The words public utility, the good of the fatherland are constantly on his lips because they have for so long been engraved in his heart. Yet even Kochubey conceded that Alexander needed assistance to act on these principles due to the political circumstances. He says, unfortunately, he is not well seconded as he would like to be. No one gets along here. So again, it's a sense of a disorganized political structure in which people do not support the Tsar and he cannot support himself. Pavel Stroganov noted a little bit more critically that Alexander was in fact unsure of himself, unsure what in fact he wanted, naturally inclined to passivity. He waited for other people to formulate his principles for him so that he could adopt them. And so Alexander in this period is up for grabs for the influence of various people who group around him, purporting to support his principles and at the same time formulating them for him. This perceived weakness in Alexander, I think, helped reaffirm the sense of his former friends that they could in fact still be friends with him. His weakness allowed a certain degree of equality between them. Secrecy was a self-consciously promoted feature of the unofficial committee. It met every week after dinner in the dressing room of Alexander I, beginning in June 1801. The dinners themselves happened at court and were attended by large numbers of courtiers and statesmen. The members of the unofficial committee used these dinners to enter the court so that nobody would notice their presence, and then after dinner and after drinks were over, would pass through a small corridor into the private rooms of Alexander I, indeed into his dressing room, a decidedly private space. Their meetings took place on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I propose that the regularity of the dates is important, underlining the importance of procedure for them, procedural regularity. At the same time, the dates can be noted as significant because of the meetings that took place on Tuesdays and Thursdays. These were the meetings of the Permanent Council, or Непременный Совет. The Permanent Council at this point was largely staffed by the courtiers who had brought Alexander I to power, including courtiers from under Catherine the Great's reign and from Paul's reign. Their interest was to use their newfound power in order to press reforms on Alexander, including the issuance of a kind of constitutional document that would have limited his powers as emperor and would have granted greater political rights to members of the nobility. One might think that Alexander and his friends would welcome this opportunity. After all, he'd always dreamt of a constitution, and yet his friends suspected that this constitution was merely a ploy to limit his powers and to raise the amount of power of these political elites or factions at court that were trying to strip him of his prerogatives as emperor. Again, a divided self or divided conception of what the autocrat ought to be. In opposing the Permanent Council, the unofficial committee acted secretly. Its opposition was not therefore public, but was self-consciously private. Stroganov, in the months leading up to the first meetings of the unofficial committee, wrote numerous documents in which he outlined its purposes and structure, and he repeatedly emphasized that secrecy must be one of the fundamental bases of this organization. He noted that even its secrecy ought to be a secret. It ought indeed to be so secret that nobody should know of its existence or who participated in it, in the sense somewhat different from the Russian Masons. So secrecy was an intentional and well-theorized element of the unofficial committee, and it was by the 18th century, late 18th century, a well-established political tool with multiple cultural and political meanings. As Jürgen Habermas has argued, secrecy and privacy both played important roles in early modern European politics. In the early modern state, quote-unquote public actors, namely state servitors, had used secrecy as a means of representing power. Spaces were reserved for initiates from the elites to demonstrate their belonging in the sacred inner sanctum of power. Yet the function of secrecy in the political sphere changed in the 18th century with the rise of secret societies, such as Masonic lodges. Here, secrecy signaled an arrogation of power by non-state actors, that is, quote-unquote, private persons. So secrecy begets privacy within the closed walls of the Masonic organization, and its secrecy allows themselves to strip themselves of their rank, emphasizing that the opinions they express within these organizations are based purely on their humanity. Habermas speaks of a bloßer Mensch, that is, a pure, naked, or simple man. They were entitled to the elaboration of this humanity, of this opinion, by virtue of their humanity. And I want to argue that this is precisely what happens in the unofficial committee. The unofficial committee members consciously create a committee that doesn't officially exist, and they claim to act within it as friends, intimate friends of the emperor, who act not on the basis of their family or high birth, but on the basis of their humanity. Simultaneously, they rejected the early modern notion of secrecy as an inner sanctum of power to which initiates belonged. They precisely did not want their secrecy to be enacted toward the outside world, leaving Alexander as the sole inhabitant of the inner sanctum of power. They wanted his laws, the laws he issued, precisely not to look as if they were the product of a competition between the Permanent Council and the unofficial committee. They wanted him to be seen to speak solely for himself. They believed that laws must seem to issue by absolute necessity, nécessité absolue, reflecting both the great law of nature, grande loi de la nature, and the absolute will of the emperor. The laws must be his creation, ouvrage. So for them, it's precisely they're helping Alexander to look like the man who simply issues natural law from his own mind. For Stroganov, therefore, any debate, any political debate or any public debate about political policies had the effect of degrading law, and it had the effect of limiting the majesty of his emperor. Worst of all, it made every law that was issued, including a potential constitution, look like a product of factional interests, look like the outcome of a winner or loser in a debate between two factions. Here, the problem of public opinion was highly relevant, and Stroganov and other members of the committee used this term frequently and debated about it. Stroganov acknowledged that it was important to be aware of public opinion, what he called esprit public, or public spirit. Lawmakers must study this public spirit in order to know how the laws would be received among the population that they governed. At the same time, making known potential changes had the effect of corrupting the public spirit, because people who began to know what laws were being planned would start debating about it, the passions and interests would get the better of them, and they would lose sight of what in fact their own beliefs and better interests were. So here we have a great quote from Stroganov, which is in the handout. In effect, if one searches for the origins of human judgment, one almost always finds passions in them deriving from interest which serve as their guides. This trait was especially strong among courtiers who were disposed to act out of pride and self-love rather than the good for the country. So insofar as public spirit or public opinion was the opinion of the political elites and the courtiers, then the courtiers were particularly ill-equipped in order to express their own true political views, much less any views that might actually be helpful for the good of the country. As he wrote, so this is a final quote, man is disposed to complain less against that which is an absolute necessity, and this for Stroganov testified in favor of issuing all laws secretly, or not issuing them secretly, but having them be the product of a secret discussion. I have a section here on the Constitution, which I can skip. How am I doing for time? Okay, good. Okay, then I will talk about the Constitution. Thank you. So here one begins to see why the debate about the Constitution became a live issue for Alexander and members of the unofficial committee. Alexander had wanted from the very get-go from April for a so-called Constitution to be debated by the committee. He had wanted to issue a constitution at the very beginning of his reforms. And yet, insofar as Alexander's ambitions hinged on higher principles, that is, principles such as rights of man or rights of citizen, which he wanted to include in his constitution, these were precisely the kinds of principles that Stroganov believed would be ill understood by the public opinion. That is, Pavel Stroganov thought that the minute you start throwing around these great words, it was likely to create a kind of a debate that would be utterly unhelpful and would not tell you anything about how high society actually felt. Alexander wished to issue a document conveying civic rights to all Russian citizens, essentially offering Russian subjects some of the rights that had been granted to the French during the Revolution of 1789, note rights of citizen and rights of man. Members of the committee appeared to have favored what they called a constitution, but wished to delay its issuance, and they viewed it differently from Alexander. They wished for a document that would guarantee rule of law. So initially there's a debate between Pavel Stroganov and Alexander I about what a constitution might consist of, and Pavel Stroganov is trying to get Alexander to agree that it should be about the creation of fundamental laws or permanent laws that would prevent what they called the arbitrary power of the despot, or our arbitrary power from changing a law. Note that for Pavel Stroganov and members of the unofficial committee, the kind of limitations to the arbitrary power of the despot would have been procedural, they would have been legal, and they would have derived from a separation of powers along the lines that Montesquieu had promoted, and they specifically named Montesquieu. In other words, they wanted a limitation on Alexander's power that would be installed without words, but which would be a matter of procedure. They wanted a constitution that would issue from a reform of state structures and not a constitution that would issue from grand words. Okay, so two small concluding paragraphs. The unofficial committee believed itself to be a set of dispassionate, disinterested persons who were speaking from the voice of nature about a set of laws that they believed were best for Russia. Of course, outsiders, other courtiers, who didn't know about the unofficial committee, simply saw these young men coming and going from the palace and assumed that, like every other courtier, they were simply out to improve their own political fortunes. Kochubey was particularly disappointed to be known as an intrigant, insofar as any of them refused official public positions, they were ridiculed in society, and then, of course, in 1802 and 1803, they were granted official positions, very high-ranking positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. These high-ranking positions that they received then confirmed the outside view of other courtiers that, in fact, the members of the unofficial committee simply were courtiers like any other, and that they were using their intimacy with Alexander to promote their own power. Significantly, their high political standing did not change committee members' low opinion of courtiers and the state apparatus more generally. Stroganov, for example, would refer to the court as, quote, this infected cesspit, ce cloaque infecté, and continually claimed that he was eager to leave it. What can we learn today from my short presentation? Well, the answer to the question, by what means could members of Russia's political elites express disagreement, dissent, or opposition against dominant policies and groups in an autocratic regime, is that they could do so unofficially, and insisted on doing so unofficially. They did it in their role as private persons, using secrecy as a means to carve out a private sphere within Russian society, and they explicitly rejected public opinion, that is, public debate about political policy, on the basis that public debates didn't correctly reflect the inner state or the inner dispositions of the well-meaning Russian nobleman. So thank you very much for your attention.
As you're quoting Habermas, I mean, of course, the idea in Habermas is, so to speak, an evolutionary one, right? I mean, you would have privacy, and you would somehow, during the 18th century, rehearse that privacy, and it would ultimately be the matrix for society to become a public society. Mm-hmm. So if you see, for example, to use another example, the correspondence between the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, and Voltaire, that sounds like a correspondence between friends. I mean, they know they are hierarchically different, but they act as if friends, and that is the projection one day for what should be the public sphere. Mm-hmm. My question is, I mean, my question would be whether in the unofficial committee or among the people you have been researching, whether there was any hope that this privacy of conversation as a principle would one day transcend the unofficial committee, would become really the matrix, the basic point, the starting point for a public sphere that would be ultimately national and all-comprehensive for society. Another remark would be, I don't know whether you have ever read the parallel critique of Habermas by Reinhard Koselleck, who says, for example, I mean, who uses the word of hypocrisy, that this model of privacy producing sheer humane interest has never functioned. There is no way that you can ever be just private. You always are driven by personal motives, even if you think that you represent what is sheerly humane interest. But that would be a footnote. I mean, my main question is really whether there was any hope among those people of the unofficial committee that one day this would become the model of something that was not only in the privacy of the unofficial committee.
Thank you very much. So this is a lot to think about. Alexander and members of the unofficial committee as courtiers were all trained to believe that they were going to be public persons. And in fact, I just saw the word public. Laharpe writes to Alexander, you are going to be a public person. And so in this way, they're really trained to believe that they're going to be in public, that people will be watching their faces, that people will be looking at them to see how they respond to things, and what the correct reaction in any situation is. So they're people who are very much raised to control their facial expressions and any kind of expression at all. And of course, in this context, any kind of letter or exchange of opinions has a public function to play. At the same time, Pavel Stroganov, for example, writes in his early years as a courtier to his father saying, remove me from here because I can't maintain my sense of I can't maintain my inner sense of self here. So at the one hand, they're raised in order to be courtiers and in order to be public people. They're also raised reading Rousseau, and they're raised with a belief that there should be this thing inside them called an inner self that they shouldn't remain loyal to. And I think that that's precisely the function of the secrecy of the unofficial committee, that it carves out a space. So it's in Alexander I's dressing room. It carves out a space in which you can. In which you both expose yourself, so you show yourself to be a naked man. You remove yourself from the public gaze, and you can display your inner traits. But of course, as you say, these are only five people. So what possibilities are there for future development? And here I'm really of two minds, because all of these, well, at least three of them had been in France and Britain during the French Revolution. I think some of this sentimentalism or their suspicion of the public sphere has a lot to do with a kind of a conservative rejection of human nature and the human spirit, the view that human beings are fundamentally passionate creatures who are incapable of self-governance. And this assessment didn't only apply to ordinary people, but it actually applied to the nobility as well. They simply thought that people are irrational, and the only way in which to cultivate personal virtue is in this extremely intimate sphere, that is in the sphere of the friendship circle. So insofar as there was going to be any resolution to Russian political problems, they were all going to come from the heart of the virtuous individual, and that's what they were helping. They thought they were trying to help Alexander to become, and in fact they were gravely disappointed in him, and the friendship fell apart, and it was a mess. But this was their idea, that they were not preparing Russia for a public. They were not preparing Russia for a public opinion. For example, they had lots of debates with Alexander in subsequent years over quite fundamental political issues. None of them ever issued a public document. None of them ever published anything in the press. So it really just is. And when they did convey their disagreements to him, it was through their wives, it was through personal conversations at court, through conversation. So this is really all about the intimate sphere of the individual as the solution to every social and political problem. And maybe it's still that way today, right? That we have these virtuous leaders, and we just have to trust in their personal virtue in order to know that everything will turn out okay.
My question really is a follow-up on Sepp's, which is to say, first of all, it seems to me in the architecture of the paper, it seems to me you're not stressing enough the contradiction in these men's beliefs, in that on the one hand, there were people who had given up on the project of the creation of a good society through the cultivation of personal virtues, yet the instrument that they chose for the correction of Russian society was the cultivation of personal virtues in one person. So there's a huge contradiction there, right? This idea that on the one hand, we can't really trust that society as a whole is going to reform itself by means of the creation of intimacy across the board among the nobility, which would allow the nobility to participate in the governance of the society as a group of collectively virtuous individuals. But the solution is that we, the few virtuous individuals who actually exist, are going to create a single virtuous, super individual, the Tsar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge contradiction in terms, and you wonder how that works out in their discursive constructions of this project. And that would be my question, really, is in the textual traces, you seem to be oriented towards the consistencies of their beliefs with regard to privacy, intimacy, friendship, and the creation of virtue. But it seems to me that one could create much analytical traction by looking for the inconsistencies.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would like to ask you about those inconsistencies. That was one.
Yeah.
But then two, it seems to me that one path towards the study of how these men were implementing these beliefs about virtue, privacy, and publicity in their own lives would be to turn from this committee to their own families and how they behaved as public individuals and private individuals. I thought it was fascinating you were saying they used their wives as communicative instruments in the later years of Alexander's reign. But how did they also attempt to become virtuous individuals, and how did they model a virtuous individuality as members of court, as members of Petersburg society? Would be another question I think that one could ask about these men.
Yeah. So on contradictions, I have to say that I was so confused while writing this paper that I thought it better to try to say something consistent rather than to burden you with all of my doubts and hesitations about what these people are actually up to. Certainly, there were fundamental inconsistencies, including their lack of faith in human nature, in the passions and self-interests as driving people. And paradoxically, when I was just sitting in the archive this last week reading some more of their letters, and one of the strange things that came to my mind was the similarity in the way that Alexander Herzen and his circle of westernizers in the 1830s described the Russian nobility as a filthy crowd, as a crowd of corrupt people, as people who don't understand truth. And yet Alexander Herzen, we think of somebody who is a defender of the intelligentsia and wants there to be some kind of a public debate. So there's a weird elitism in these people who think that they somehow are the elect, right? That they have the personal inner qualities, the personal virtues, which they construct through friendship, that should allow them this immense political power and influence. But you're absolutely right that it is a contradiction, and I guess it's a contradiction that subsequent people like Herzen and Agriov will resolve differently. The matter of families is really fascinating and very strange. You may know or you may not know that one of the bases of the friendship between Czartoryski and Alexander I was that before Alexander I came to power, Czartoryski became the lover of Alexander I's wife, Elizabeth, and Alexander actually was the go-between between them and promoted this union. Alexander simultaneously was in love with the wife of Pavel Stroganov, who rebutted his advances, but nevertheless, through his advances, formed a strong friendship with Elizabeth, Alexander I's wife, and thus became a real insider at court, feeding Pavel Stroganov and others lots of information about what was happening there. Novosiltsev was quite the ladies' man, I think. He had quite an 18th century way of behaving. He was a kind of a sladostrastnik, you could say. And Kochubey was continually, he was married. And so that was at least one person. So this is certainly not a kind of, So what's interesting is that this is not the bourgeois family of the mid-19th century at all yet. This is still the Russian nobility who behave with all of the marks of the Russian nobility. But one thing actually that Yelena Marasinova and I were talking about is the interesting way in which the Russian nobility does selectively take up Western European traits, including these traits of bourgeois privacy, interiority, and begin to work with them and maybe even play with them. But they're playing both roles at the same time. So it is a strange theater or comedy in which they are, or as Lotman actually said, it's kind of trivial that we come back to just repeating the views that he already told us to think. But yeah, the people are playing roles, putting on masks, taking off masks in different environments. But yeah, the family, as it happens, is not a sphere of bourgeois intimacy, and that's why I'm emphasizing secrecy, because I think it's something about the secret committee that creates a private sphere in which these people can, at least within the committee, consistently act as virtuous persons.
I wanted to ask about secrecy. I seem to remember that one of 20th century political theorists, it might be Hannah Arendt, or maybe it just seems to me that it's Hannah Arendt because I love her so much, so whatever is interesting, I think she said it. But so one of them said that secrecy, very often in societies which are highly regulated, closed, totalitarian, authoritarian, secrecy is not necessarily a defense against something, or not necessarily carving out private space for oneself, but it is actually the reverse. That is, it is actually a legitimizing technique for one's power or right to power, claim to power, future or present. That is, what this particular theorist says, I think, is that whenever things become too normal to prevent this routine from setting in, secrecy would be instituted, so to say, even when there is no need for it, just for the sake of the ritual. So what I mean is that when you talked about, and that is fascinating, about all the secret rituals surrounding the meetings, do you think there is any place for maybe taking an alternative look on this, just as a ritual for ritual's sake?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I began with this principle in mind, and I'm very partial to Georg Simmel's theories on secrecy, whereby secrecy really is a performance that is directed toward an outside world to show the election and arrogation of power by the participants in the secret circle. I think in this case it doesn't work for the secret committee, and that's what one of the fascinating things for me about writing this particular paper was that I saw that theory, at least so far as I understand it, doesn't apply to them, and that they're really trying to do something fundamentally different. That is, it's insofar as it's a ritual, it's one that they enact only for each other and not for any outsider. And so in that sense you could say, yes, it's a game. Alexander entertains himself with, talking to them about his secret signals. But it's not a legitimizing tool. And here's something else that is interesting to me. So if you read about the history of opposition in the Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, one of the points that they make is that the concept of opposition did not easily translate from England, where we really begin to see it legitimized in the 1790s through Parliament, but also through journalists coming into Parliament to report on what's happening in Parliament, that this concept of a legitimate opposition doesn't translate to other countries, for example, France, and not into France until the 1830s, because the idea is that opposition undermines national unity. So opposition undermines a sense of a public spirit that would have a single political idea that could then be realized through the state. And this is why in Williams Ready's account, opposition in the French Revolution becomes so dangerous and people need to be executed precisely because opposition is not something that can be negotiated. And I think that's one extra reason why the unofficial committee wouldn't want their secret to become what they call a mystery. They don't want to make a mystery out of their secret.
I wanted a little bit to deliberate further on what Kevin just said. It is, I think, a very important institution showing a lot of features of this life. First of all, they were all, the debate was virtue versus rank and whatever, but all of them belonged to the highest imaginable aristocracy, and all of them were indecently rich.
Yeah.
Unbelievably indecently rich.
Yeah.
Stroganovs, Czartoryskis, and whoever. Yeah, that's one thing. Another thing is, of course, they were all about the rule of law and using to establish it semi-dictatorial power, which they absolutely illegally assumed for themselves. They were not a part of any legal institution. And they wanted in this totally illegal way to assume a rule of law in the country. Yeah, and then they wanted to enlighten the whole society, and whatever they said about their peers was nothing but contempt. They didn't have anything but total contempt to anyone around them. Yeah, you know what Stroganov said about Russian nobility and whatever, so whatever measures could be taken, they'll praise the emperor for all the measures taken against their interests. So no one's interests were to be taken into account and whatever. So that was the most authoritarian and dictatorial body, in the preceding Russian history. Later on we had a lot of much more dictatorial and authoritarian, but in the preceding Russian history we didn't know anything of this kind of total usurpation of power, total arrogance towards population, whatever. But of course, they viewed themselves as enlightened, liberal, European, assuming rule of law, British parliamentarians, and so on and so forth. And that's an interesting story.
Pavel Stroganov owned
very typical.
Pavel Stroganov owned 45,000 serfs. Alexander Herzen, for example, I think had 3,000 or 2,000 inherited. So that's the level of difference here. And of course, this wealth of theirs was one important reason why they thought rule of law was important, because for them, rule of law was also about protection of personal property. So private property was, for them, was one of the things that was supposed to be maintained by these administrative changes, which were supposed to guarantee rule of law. Now, of course, as you also know, private property was an important feature of liberalism in the late 18th century. It wasn't only promoted by people with 45 million serfs, but by, you know, our good American Democrats. So to me, what's interesting about private property is its malleability. Of course, private property did become one of the reasons for why some Americans didn't want to abolish slavery in the 1860s. So that was again put forward as an important liberal principle. So yeah, private property is a very malleable principle. One of the things that I want to explore further is whether there's a link between privacy, as in privacy and intimacy, the private sphere, private space, and private property, because there, in every language, in French and in Russian and in English, there's a connection between those two words. So I want to think about that harder. But yes, if you want to say that these members of the unofficial committee are what should we say, boys, golden boys who want to arrogate power to themselves and have contempt for other people, there's something to it. But they're not unsophisticated golden boys. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a question that I have is actually about the concepts, because you mentioned some concepts, and from the quotations that you made, we see that they input a whole vocabulary of political concepts in their correspondence. So these people have so much in common in terms of education, in terms of culture and language also. I think this import of political concept is facilitated by the language they use. The exchanges, as far as I know, are made mostly in French. So do you find in this correspondence discussions about the meaning of this or that term? Do they share the same vocabulary, political vocabulary? Are they really, do they understand perfectly each other when they are talking about political things? Well, you mentioned some of these concepts like fundamental laws, absolute necessity, and some others, but there are many others,
right.
Other political concepts that they use in their correspondence.
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think that they mostly did understand each other, with the exception of the terrible word constitution, about which already numerous articles have been written about what was actually meant by the word constitution in the late 18th and early 19th century. And it seems to me that contemporaries seem to have been confused about this as well. So I actually think that Pavel Stroganov, when he and Alexander debated whether a constitution should be issued, that they both believed that a constitution should be issued. The problem was that they really didn't agree one iota about what the content of this constitution should be. And I think that the same thing applies to Czartoryski and Kochubey and Novosiltsev, that they use the term and they don't agree on about what it is. So I think I was actually telling you that 2 days ago I was reading a letter by Czartoryski to Stroganov, I think in 1807 or around then, upbraiding him for abandoning their previous beliefs in, for example, he says, you have abandoned our belief in the Constitution. So he posits that they used to have this belief in this concept, but he apparently either he isn't aware that they might have had a different idea about what that would entail, or he thinks that they once agreed but now no longer agree. So I think there is some degree of confusion around the specific term, much more so than around, I haven't found any other kind of confusion, I think this is a problem that we're aware of with respect to that one bad term.
I would like to know at a more conceptual level how you understand friendship, because I mean you've written extensively on this, and how then you trace the limits between friendship and public life. Mm-hmm. And yes. How are you then putting forward this category of friendship as a kind of social category to understand political group dynamics?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I have a slightly unusual approach which continually gets me in trouble, namely that I call people friends who use the word towards each other in a very robust and sustained way. So I believe that Alexander I and Czartoryski or Kochubey or La Harpe could be friends. I would call them friends if they call each other friends in a sustained way and continue to call each other friends, and for as long as they call each other friends. And of course, I'm very interested in how their designations of friendship match 18th century and early 19th century writings about the nature of friendship. And there were hundreds of tracts and poems and plays and philosophical treatises dedicated to this topic, spanning from Aristotle and Cicero, Seneca to Rousseau and well beyond. So the question then is, how do they use these theories? How selective are they in applying these theories to their own behavior towards one another? And I am particularly interested in breaches of friendship, so in ruptures between people, to try to find out under what circumstances, for what reasons, they think that the other person has breached a law of good relations. So I'm very interested in hearing when somebody is disappointed or complaining to somebody else that he has been betrayed or that their friendship no longer matters to them. And this was something that people in the late 18th century and early 19th century could spend endless periods of time writing about. So, for example, Czartoryski wrote a memoir, a special memoir for Alexander I, which he gave to Pavel Stroganov's wife. In 1810, he sent it to her in a letter. So we know that he has a 2-volume memoir, but he has a very short French memoir in which he tries to explain why he wants to leave the service of Alexander I. For him, leaving Alexander I's service is a personal affront. It's a personal disappointment, but he needs to ground it in his true and heartfelt feelings to Alexander from the very beginning, and then explain how it could come to be that he would have other priorities that would prevent him from further feeling himself obligated toward Alexander I's friendship. So these are precisely the kind of in my ordinary scholarly life, these are precisely the kind of documents that interest me. So the rules, the sentimentalism as a rule of behavior that dictates people's behavior and how and when they depart from the model, and then, but also how this shapes political relationships at the highest level of the administration. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Again.
Thank you.